She doesn't have the numbers for this shot. Major Callum said it loud enough for the entire observation deck to hear. 12 officers, 3 visiting Pentagon analysts, and 1 4-star general who had flown in from Washington specifically for this evaluation. Callum said it the way a man says something he has already decided is fact, not opinion. Flat, final. The kind of statement designed not to inform the room, but to preemptively own whatever happened next. The woman standing at the rifle station 40 meters away had her back to all of them. She was adjusting the scope on a .338 Lapua Magnum with the focused economy of someone performing a task she has done so many times it no longer requires conscious attention. She had heard him. The wind was blowing toward the observation deck, not away from it, and she had been trained since the age of 11 to register everything within audible range as potentially relevant data. Her name was Petra Sullivan, Staff Sergeant, Army Marksmanship Unit, 29 years old, born in Flagstaff, Arizona, in a house that backed up against a ridge her father had used as an informal range since before she could walk. She set the scope and said nothing. If this story stays with you, drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far it travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, stay until the end. Because what happens on that range is going to change the way you think about what precision actually means. Fort Calder, Nevada. The Army's Advanced Marksmanship Evaluation had been running for 9 years. It was the kind of program that existed in the specific overlap between combat readiness and institutional pride, a week-long series of increasingly complex shooting scenarios designed to identify candidates for a classified long-range engagement unit that the Army referred to in public documentation only as Selection Group 7. Nobody outside the program used that name. Inside the program, most people just called it the 7, and getting an invitation to compete was the kind of career milestone that changed everything that came after it. Major Darian Callum had been the program's chief evaluator for 4 of those 9 years. He was 51, 6'1", with the upright posture of a man who had decided decades ago that the way you hold your body communicates something important about who you are. He had been a decent marksman himself in his 30s, good enough to earn his place in rooms like this one. Not exceptional. He knew the difference. Men who know the difference between decent and exceptional tend to fall into 2 categories: the ones who respect the exceptional and the ones who resent it. Callum fell into the second category in the specific way of someone who had never been forced to confront that about himself, because until now the exceptional people in those rooms had always looked the way he expected exceptional people to look. Petra Sullivan did not look the way he expected. She was 5'4". She had pulled her hair back in a regulation braid that was already starting to come loose at the left temple from the hours she had spent prone on the practice range that morning. She wore standard issue range gear without any of the small personalizations, the custom grip tape, the lucky patches that most competitors added over time. She carried a notebook, not a phone, not a tablet, a physical notebook with a green cover, the kind you buy in bulk, filled with what the officers who had glimpsed its pages described as dense columns of handwritten calculation that looked more like graduate-level physics than anything they associated with field marksmanship. She had been recommended for the evaluation by her direct commanding officer, Captain Doyle, who had submitted the paperwork 3 times before it was processed. The first 2 submissions had been returned with administrative notes that the evaluators later described as clerical errors, but which Doyle, who was not a man given to cynicism, privately understood as something else. The 3rd submission went through. When Callum had seen Sullivan's name on the roster 2 weeks before the evaluation began, he had spent approximately 90 seconds reviewing her service record and then set it aside. Her scores from conventional range qualification were in the top 6% of all active duty marksmen. In a different context, that number would have earned immediate attention. Callum read it and moved on. He was not sure, if asked later why, he would not have had a clean answer. The evaluation opened on a Monday with the standard 500-meter qualification series, 16 competitors, 12 men, 4 women. The 4 women had been the largest cohort in the program's history, which was the kind of statistic that meant nothing to the competitors themselves and considerable amounts to the institutional observers who tracked such things. Sullivan shot the 500-meter series first and finished it in the middle of the field, 9th out of 16. Callum watched from the observation platform with his arms crossed and did not say anything because there was nothing to say. Middle of the field, expected. What Callum did not have context for, because he had not read the full file, was that Sullivan had been nursing a wind call correction through the entire series, that none of the other shooters had picked up a micro-variance in the crosswind pattern caused by a gap in the berm to the northwest that was pushing the ambient current at approximately 4 degrees off what the posted range flags indicated. She had corrected for it manually on every shot, adding an average of 11 seconds to her total time per round. She had shot 9th, and she had shot accurately. The two facts were connected in a way that the scoreboard did not show. The shooter who finished first, a Special Forces staff sergeant named Riggs, had groupings that were technically tighter than hers on paper. He had also taken the wind reading at face value. 2 of his shots had caught the edge of the correction zone and pulled fractionally wide. The margin was within acceptable parameters. Nobody flagged it, but Sergeant Ellie Vance, a 10-year veteran who ran the range's data analysis system from a station at the back of the observation deck, had seen it, and she had pulled the wind variance log for that session, and she had made a note. Vance was the kind of person who existed at the margins of institutions, necessary, invisible, and in possession of more accurate information than anyone above her in the chain of command. She had worked at Fort Calder for 6 years. She had seen the evaluation run 5 times. She had, over those 5 iterations, developed the specific brand of institutional wisdom that comes from being the person who measures everything and decides nothing. She watched Sullivan shoot, and then she watched the scoreboard, and then she looked at her wind variance log, and she made a note because that was what she did. The second day's scenarios were set at 800 meters. The range at 800 had a significant change in elevation profile, and the thermal layer above the target zone shifted predictably between morning and afternoon sessions, in a pattern that added between 3 and 7 minutes of angle, in effective bullet drop depending on what time of day you were shooting and what the ambient temperature was doing. Most shooters received a briefing sheet with the day's atmospheric data. Sullivan had arrived 2 hours before the briefing and had been sitting in the grass at the edge of the range with her notebook open, taking readings with a Kestrel weather meter and writing columns of figures that she then cross-referenced against what she described in her notes as the baseline thermal gradient for that specific geographic corridor in late October at elevation. Corporal Trask, 19 years old and 3 months into his first posting, had been assigned to grounds maintenance on the range that morning. He saw her sitting in the grass with the notebook and the weather meter and did not know what to make of her. He had grown up in rural Montana. He knew what it looked like when someone was doing serious preparation and what it looked like when someone was doing something else, and this looked serious. He carried on with his maintenance duties and said nothing to anyone. That afternoon, Sullivan shot the 800-meter series and finished third. Callum was on the observation deck. He saw the score posted. He said to the officer standing next to him, a colonel named Vickers who had flown in from Colorado, "Could be luck at this distance. Cross corrections are hard to verify cleanly." Vickers, who had spent 28 years in the Army and had developed over those years the specific patience of someone who does not volunteer opinions unless asked directly, looked at the scoreboard and said nothing. The third day was where the evaluation departed from what any of the 16 competitors had been briefed to expect. The scenario was presented at 0700 during morning assembly, a simulated forward observation problem. Target at an unknown distance between 900 and 1400 meters. Position obscured by partial cover. Atmospheric conditions not provided. Competitors would be required to calculate distance independently using only a mil-dot reticle and a range card, then factor their own atmospheric solution, then engage. No wind flags, no Kestrel data posted, 1 shot per competitor. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when people are recalculating something they thought they had already figured out, because 1 shot at an unknown distance with self-generated atmospheric data at over 900 meters was not a marksmanship problem. It was a physics problem. It was a mathematics problem. It was the kind of scenario that separated people who could shoot from people who understood the entire environmental system that a bullet traveled through on its way from the barrel to a target. Callum addressed the assembled competitors with his hands behind his back. You will have 45 minutes of preparation time before the first shooter is called. Range data is available from the observation tower. What you do with it is your business. Sullivan was already writing in her notebook. She had known this scenario was coming, not because anyone had told her, but because she had read every available account of the evaluation's history, including an informal after-action summary posted in a veterans forum by a competitor from 3 years prior who had described day 3 as the day the real test starts. She had prepared for this specific problem for 4 months. She had built a calculation model in the notebook that accounted for 11 independent atmospheric variables and could be updated in real time with new data. The model was not theoretical. She had tested and refined it over 2 years of personal range work on the ridgeline above her parents' house in Flagstaff, the same ridgeline her father had used, which happened to have a natural target placement at approximately 1,100 meters against a rock formation she had been shooting at since she was 13. Her father had been a surveyor by profession. He had taught her to measure things before he taught her to shoot, which was not the sequence most shooting instructors would recommend, but which had given her something most instructors could not give: an intuitive relationship between number and physical reality, between the column of figures in the notebook and the actual path of an actual object through actual air. He had died when she was 22. Complications from a surgery that was supposed to be routine, the kind of outcome that arrives without dramatic warning, that has no villain, that offers no target for the grief that follows. She still heard his voice when she was doing the calculations, not telling her what to do, just present. The way the people who have shaped you are always present in the moments that matter. Sullivan spent 38 of the 45 preparation minutes in the observation tower, taking readings at 3-minute intervals and entering each one into her model. She used the mil-dot reticle to estimate target distance and triangulate it against 3 reference points she had identified on the range map the previous evening. Her final distance estimate was 963 meters. She wrote it in the notebook with a box around it. At 0850, the first competitor was called. By the time Sullivan was called, 7th in rotation, 4 of the previous 6 shooters had missed. Riggs had connected, though the post-shot analysis showed his atmospheric solution had been partially incorrect, and his hit had come in at the edge of the target rather than center mass. One other competitor, an Army Ranger named Burnett, had connected cleanly. Sullivan walked to the station. She lay prone. She set the rifle. From the observation deck, Callum watched. He had been quieter than usual that morning. The scenario was performing the function it always performed. It revealed the difference between what people knew and what they understood. He had watched Riggs, his expected top performer, connect on luck more than solution. He did not say this aloud. Sullivan spent 90 seconds on the scope after setting her position. She was running her final calculations with a small pen on the back of her left forearm, which was the flattest available surface when she was prone that she could see without moving her head significantly. 3 numbers. She wrote them on her arm, referenced the notebook one final time, and then set the notebook aside. She fired once. The target registered a center mass impact at 961 meters. The observation deck did not erupt. What it did was go very still in the specific way of a group of people who have just registered something that does not fit the category they had prepared for it. Callum said nothing for 5 seconds. Then he said, "Get me the shot data." Sergeant Vance had the shot data before he finished the sentence because she had been tracking Sullivan since the second day. Callum looked at the data. The atmospheric solution Sullivan had generated was not approximately correct. It was correct. Not within acceptable deviation. Correct. The kind of solution you built when you understood exactly what the air was doing between the muzzle and the target for every one of the 961 meters that separated them. Callum set the printout down. He looked at Sullivan still at the station, methodically clearing her weapon before standing. could be, he said to Vickers quietly, that she had the conditions dialed in from a previous run. Vickers looked at him. There had been no previous run. Every competitor shot the scenario once, from a position they had not been assigned until that morning. Callum knew this. He had designed the protocol himself. Vickers picked up his coffee and walked toward the far end of the observation deck and did not say anything. That afternoon, Trask, who had been thinking about what he had seen in the grass that morning since approximately 900, found Sergeant Vance near the equipment station. "That shooter," Trask said. "Sullivan, the one who went 7th. Vance looked at him. "She was out on the range before the briefing, 2 hours before, taking readings." Vance was quiet for a moment. She had already inferred this from the quality of Sullivan's atmospheric data, but hearing it stated as direct observation mattered. It moved something from inference to fact. "Did you report that?" Vance asked. "I'm reporting it to you. I'm not in the chain of command for evaluations." "I know," Trask said, "but you're the person who knows what it means." Vance looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has spent 6 years being the person who knows what things mean and has also spent 6 years watching that knowledge have a limited radius. Then she wrote it in her notes. Day 4. The 4th day's scenario was a moving target problem at 700 meters, variable speed, variable direction, simulated wind change injected at the 30-second mark. Real-time adjustment required. Sullivan went first in the rotation. She had been first alphabetically, and the draw had placed her at the top of the order, which was the least advantageous position because she would have no information from other shooters' attempts to reference. This was known in the evaluation community as the cold slot. Most competitors preferred not to draw it. Sullivan, watching the range officer read out the order that morning, had simply nodded and gone back to writing in her notebook. She engaged the moving target at 41 seconds, after the wind injection, after the speed change at a moment when the target had reached the far edge of its travel arc and was presenting the briefest period of relative stability before reversing direction. It was not the moment most shooters would have chosen. Most shooters would have taken the earlier, simpler geometry. She had identified the reversal point during the 2-minute observation window before engagement and had calculated that the stability window at that moment, though shorter in absolute terms, had a higher probability of clean solution given the combined wind and movement variables. She had traded certainty of timing for quality of atmospheric conditions. She connected. The analysis printed from Vance's station showed a solution that was not just accurate but explained. Sullivan had annotated her range card in real time with the rationale for each adjustment as she made it. The annotations were in the same handwriting as the notebook, dense, specific, and completely correct. Callum reviewed the annotated range card without speaking. The room around him was not silent exactly, but it had the quality of a room where the primary conversation has shifted to something people are not yet saying out loud. That evening, in the officers' quarters building, Callum sat with a glass of water and the evaluation packet for Petra Sullivan that he had been carrying around since the first day and not reading beyond the first page. He read it now, all of it. He read the recommendation letters from Captain Doyle and 2 other officers who had served alongside Sullivan. He read the description of the range work in Flagstaff that she had documented for a marksmanship certification submission. He read the note from a university mathematics professor named Dr. Greaves, attached as supplementary material, who had corresponded with Sullivan about the ballistic modeling work she had been doing independently and who described it with words Callum had to read twice because they were not words he associated with a staff sergeant from Arizona. He read the brief notation at the end of the file describing her father's occupation and the date of his death and the subsequent documented uptick in her range hours. He set the file down. He was not a man without intelligence. He had spent his career in service of something he believed in, and the belief had been genuine. But he had also spent that career inside an institution with specific shapes, and he had allowed those shapes to do some of his thinking for him in ways he had not examined. A file that arrived 3 times before it was processed. A first-day score he had categorized as middle of the field, without asking why. He sat with the water and the file for a long time. The final day of the evaluation was the scenario that determined Selection Group 7 nominations. It was never announced as such. The program documentation described it only as the composite assessment, a scenario that combined elements from every previous day's challenges into a single integrated problem. What it actually was, in the understanding of the competitors who had been through the first 4 days, was the real test, the one everything else had been building toward. The composite assessment was set at 1,100 meters, 2 targets sequenced. The first target would be engaged at a moment of the competitor's choosing within a 4-minute window. The second target would appear at a random moment between 0 and 90 seconds after the first shot was fired, at a slightly different bearing requiring a full solution, recalculation, and re-engagement within 60 seconds. Atmospheric data would be provided for baseline but not updated in real time. Actual conditions might deviate. It was a problem designed to test not just the ability to solve a shooting solution, but the ability to maintain 2 parallel solution threads simultaneously to hold the first problem and the second problem in the mind at the same time without losing precision on either. Callum gave the briefing at 0730. He stood in front of the assembled competitors and spoke with the flat precision he had used all week. Sullivan was sitting in the 3rd row. She did not look at Callum. She was looking at the range diagram that had been handed out with the briefing packet, and she was already working. The first competitor went at 0900. Sullivan drew the 9th slot. In the time between the briefing and her call, she sat in the preparation area and ran the problem continuously, not drilling it, running it, holding both targets in her head simultaneously, and building a solution architecture that allowed her to move from the first to the second without rebuilding from zero, carrying the common elements of the atmospheric solution as constants and isolating the bearing differential and elevation change as the only variables that needed recalculation. It was a method she had developed over 2 years for a different application. Her father had used it, she later understood, when surveying large properties. The ability to hold an entire spatial model in the mind and update only the elements that had changed, rather than starting fresh each time, was something he had explained to her at age 14 as efficiency, and which she had understood only later as a different relationship to spatial information than most people had. She thought in the same geometric terms he had. She always had. She thought about him often on ranges. The specific combination of complete technical focus and his voice in the background was the mental state she performed best from, and it was not something she had sought or designed. It simply was. At 11:07, the range officer called her name. Sullivan walked to the station. She confirmed her rifle setup, confirmed her notebook was positioned where she could reference it without repositioning her body, and lay prone. She spent the first 90 seconds of the 4-minute window doing nothing that looked. From the observation deck, like active preparation, she was still. Her breathing had dropped to the rhythm she had trained herself to maintain under significant observational pressure. In for 4 counts, hold for 2, out for 6. The heart rate consequence of that pattern made her pulse visible only at the base of her throat, which was how her father had described it when he taught her. "You want a pulse that's doing its job quietly," he had said. "Like good infrastructure. You don't notice it when it's working right." She engaged the first target at the 2-minute 43-second mark. The connection was center mass. The second target appeared 11 seconds later, bearing left, elevation lower by an estimated 8 meters, at what Vance's instruments later confirmed was 9 meters. Sullivan had already begun the recalculation. The 60-second window closed at 1 minute and 12 seconds, with Sullivan's second shot recorded at 41 seconds after target appearance. Second connection, center mass. The observation deck did not make the sound of a crowd that has been entertained. It made the sound of a group of professionals who have witnessed something in their field that recalibrates their understanding of what the field contains. Specific, quiet. The kind of reaction that comes not from performance, but from honest recognition. General Adler, who had flown from Washington and who had said approximately 11 words total in 5 days on the observation deck, turned to the officer to his left. He did not say anything. He made a note on the pad he had been carrying all week. Callum stood at the front of the deck with his hands at his sides. He had said on day one that she didn't have the numbers for this shot. The numbers she had just produced were not within the expected range of the evaluation's historical top performers. They were outside it. They represented a solution architecture that the program's designers had considered theoretically possible and had included in the composite scenario design as an aspiration level, not an expectation. Sergeant Vance, running the data analysis, printed the results and handed them to Callum without comment because she was the kind of person who let facts speak with their own voice. Callum held the printout for a long moment. Then he walked down from the observation deck to the preparation area where Sullivan was methodically clearing her rifle and returning it to its case with the same focused economy she had brought to everything all week. She did not look up when she heard footsteps. She registered them, filed them as non-urgent, and continued the clearing process. "Sullivan," Callum said. She looked up. He was carrying the printout. He held it in the specific way of a person who is holding something they have been carrying longer than just the walk down from the deck. He did not say, "I was wrong," because he was not a man whose vocabulary included that particular construction. But what he said, in the specific register of a senior officer who has arrived somewhere he had not expected to arrive, was, "Your solution architecture on the composite. Walk me through it." Not as an evaluator asking for a debrief. As someone asking to understand. Sullivan looked at him for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with any of the performances of vindication. She looked at him the way she had been looking at ranges all week, with the accurate, direct attention of someone trying to read what is actually present. What was present was a man who had not read her file until the night before, and who had arrived, late and at significant cost to his own internal framework, at the question he should have been asking at the beginning. She opened the notebook to the composite solution page. "Start with the shared atmospheric constants," she said. "That's the architecture." He looked at the notebook. She walked him through it. It took 20 minutes. He did not interrupt. He asked 3 questions, all of them substantive, and she answered them with the specificity of someone who had been building this framework for 2 years and could explain any part of it from any angle. When she finished, Callum was quiet for a moment. He looked at the notebook page. Then he looked up. "Your father was a surveyor," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Sullivan said. "This model," Callum said carefully, "the way you're holding the parallel solution threads. It's not a ballistics framework." "No," Sullivan said. "It's a spatial modeling framework. He used it for large plot survey work. I adapted it." Callum was quiet again. He was doing the internal work of a man who is updating something significant, which is slow and visible if you know what to look for. "He trained you," Callum said. Sullivan looked at her notebook, at the handwriting that was hers but carried, in the density and the structure, the fingerprints of a methodology she had absorbed before she understood it as methodology. "He showed me how to measure things first," she said. "The shooting came after." She paused. "He said the problem with most marksmen is they learn to shoot before they learn to think about what a bullet actually is. A physical object, moving through a physical environment, subject to every law that everything else is subject to." She closed the notebook. "He said if you understand what it is, the rest is arithmetic." Callum absorbed that. He looked at the range. He was standing on the same ground where, 5 days ago, he had made a declaration to a room of senior officers and Pentagon analysts about what this woman did and did not possess. He had been wrong, in the specific way you are wrong, when you let the shape of a category do your thinking. When you look at a roster and read a name and make a decision that you do not recognize as a decision because it does not feel like one. It feels like assessment. The distinction between those two things was, he understood now, the difference between what he had thought he was doing all week and what he had actually been doing. He did not say any of this to Sullivan because she did not need to hear it from him. She had operated all week in full knowledge of the gap between his assessment and the reality she was carrying in that notebook. She had not required his recognition to continue doing the work. That was perhaps the thing that hit him most clearly in the preparation area on that final afternoon. That his opinion of her had been, in every functional sense, irrelevant. It had affected the administrative history of her file. It had shaped the room's first-day atmosphere. It had not affected her performance by a single measurable fraction. The nominations for Selection Group 7 were submitted at 1800 that evening. Callum was the primary evaluator. The nomination packet required a ranking of the top 3 candidates with individual assessments attached. He wrote Sullivan's assessment himself, which was not unusual. He wrote it, and then he deleted the first draft and wrote it again. The first draft had the structure of a positive evaluation that was also, in its phrasing, a kind of qualified surprise. The second draft did not contain surprise. It contained observation accurately stated. He submitted the second draft. The results were not announced on the base. They arrived individually, in sealed envelopes, through the administrative office. Sullivan was in the practice area, running maintenance on her rifle, when Captain Doyle appeared at the edge of the range with an envelope and an expression that communicated several things simultaneously, the primary one being that he had spent 3 submission attempts on this file and had never stopped believing it would arrive where it was supposed to. Sullivan set down the rifle. She opened the envelope. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on the range table, both hands flat beside it, and breathed. It was the specific breath of someone who has been carrying a weight they chose to carry and who is, for the first moment in a long time, setting it down, not because the weight is gone, because there is now somewhere to put it. Doyle waited. "Well," he said. She looked up. Something moved across her face that she did not perform for the range or the base or the institution that had just formally recognized her. Something private and unguarded, the specific expression of a person who has received something they have worked toward and who is, in the same moment, missing the person they most want to tell. "I'm in," she said. Doyle exhaled. He had been holding that breath for 4 months, since the first submission. She picked up the letter and read the bottom paragraph again. It cited specific performance data from the composite assessment. It described her solution architecture in the formal language of official documentation as a demonstrably novel application of spatial modeling principles to ballistic solution generation. That was not her language. But what the words described, in the clinical framework of institutional recognition, was her father's methodology, applied by her in a rifle station at 1,100 meters in front of 12 officers and 3 Pentagon analysts and 1 4-star general who had made a note on a pad and then made a phone call to an office at the Pentagon at 18:30 that evening to say something that would set a second administrative process in motion. Sullivan did not know about that phone call yet. She knew about the letter. She folded it once, the way she folded things that mattered, and put it in the interior pocket of her jacket. She picked up the rifle and went back to maintenance. Some things you process in motion. Some things you can only hold while your hands are doing something they know how to do. Cleaning a rifle is a task her father had taught her alongside the calculations, alongside the measurement methodology, alongside the specific understanding that precision is not a talent. It is a practice, something you choose and then choose again every day until the choosing is no longer a decision but a posture. She had been choosing it since she was 11 years old on a ridgeline in Arizona with a man who measured things carefully and taught her that numbers were not abstract. They were the language the physical world used to describe itself, and if you learned to listen, you could hear everything. The months that followed were not quiet. The announcement of the Selection Group 7 cohort generated internal Army attention of a kind that the evaluation's administrators had not specifically prepared for, which was itself useful data about the gap between institutional intention and institutional preparation. Sullivan's name appeared in the cohort alongside 5 other selectees. She was the only woman. She was the highest scoring composite performance in the evaluation's 9-year history. That number moved through channels before she was fully aware it was moving. Trask heard about it in a roundabout way, third hand through the administrative office, and sat with it for a long time in his bunk before he found Vance at her station and told her. Vance already knew. She had the data. She acknowledged it with the expression of someone for whom the number confirmed something she had already understood and had been waiting for the record to catch up to. Torres, who was stationed across the base in a communications role and who had watched 2 of Sullivan's range days from a distance out of personal curiosity, heard the number from Trask and did the thing that people do when they hear a number that recontextualizes everything else they have observed. He went quiet for a moment, recalibrating. Then he said, "That explains the notebook." It did not explain the notebook. The notebook explained itself to anyone who had seen it. But Torres meant something accurate by the statement, which was that the output makes sense when you understand the system that generated it. Callum had his formal review with the program director 6 weeks after the evaluation. It was a standard annual review. The evaluation outcomes were part of the documentation. The program director, a brigadier general named O.C., who had run the 7 for 4 years, and who had the specific institutional patience of someone who plays a long game in large organizations, reviewed the evaluation outcomes and then looked at Callum across the table. "The Sullivan performance," O.C. said. "Walk me through your day 1 read." Callum was quiet for a moment. He did. He stated it clearly, including the declaration from the observation deck on the first morning. He did not editorialize. He described what he had said and what the basis for it had been, and by the time he finished, the clarity of what that basis had actually been was visible in the room without anyone having to name it. O.C. listened. He made 2 notes. "The file was submitted 3 times, O.C. said. "Yes, that's a pattern worth examining." "Yes," Callum said, "it is." O.C. looked at him. "Are you examining it?" Callum was quiet for a moment. He had been examining it since the night before the final day when he had read the file in its entirety. "Yes," he said, "I am." O.C. nodded once. He made a 3rd note. He did not describe the nature of the note to Callum. It was the specific kind of note made by a person who is watching someone do the actual internal work and who understands that the internal work is both necessary and slow and is not something you can rush by acknowledging it out loud. The formal administrative change to the submission protocol, requiring a standardized file review checklist before any evaluation roster could be finalized, was published 4 months after the evaluation. As part of a larger program review document, it cited, in the body of the supporting analysis, a submission anomaly in the most recent evaluation cycle as a contributing factor. It did not use Sullivan's name. It did not need to. Vance read the published document the morning it was released. She read the supporting analysis section twice. Then she filed it in the program archive with the notations from the evaluation week attached. She made 1 additional note on the archive entry in the field designated for evaluator observations. Wind variance, day 1. Self-generated correction. Noted. It was the most complete record of what had happened at Fort Calder that week, and it lived where most complete records live. In the margins, maintained by the person who had been measuring things all along. Sullivan was running drills on a training range in the Mojave when the program document was published. She did not know about it until Doyle forwarded her a copy 3 days later with a single line at the bottom of the email. "For your records." She read it during a 10-minute rest period, sitting on the tailgate of a truck with a water bottle and the perpetual Nevada wind moving across the flat ground. She read the submission anomaly section. She knew what it referred to. She put her phone away and finished her water and picked up the rifle and went back to work. Her father had told her once, when she was 17 and had shot badly in a competition and was trying to understand what she had done wrong, that the useful thing about getting something wrong was not the correction itself, but the new understanding of the system that the error revealed. "You don't fix the shot," he had said. "You fix your model of what the shot is. Then the shot fixes itself." She had spent 12 years understanding that sentence more completely. She was still understanding it. The wind changed at the far end of the Mojave Range, the way desert wind changes, without announcement, without preliminary. She registered the new bearing from the way the fine dust moved across the ground in front of her position. She updated her solution. She continued.